There is a sound a microphone makes when it hits the floor of a silent church. A hollow, echoing thud that bounces off stained glass windows and wooden pews and lands somewhere in the chest of every person in the room. I know that sound well, because the last thing I heard before I died was my own microphone hitting the floor of my church. And the last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me whole was the terrified faces of 400 members of my congregation staring back at me. What happened next, in the minutes that followed, I have spent 3 years trying to find the words to describe. Today, I finally have them. I want you to understand something before I tell you what I saw. I want you to understand who I was, because the man who collapsed behind that pulpit on a Sunday morning in October was not the man most people thought they knew. My name is David Calloway. I am 45 years old. I was born the third son of a Baptist preacher in rural Georgia, which means I didn't choose the church so much as the church chose me. I grew up between hymn books and Wednesday night prayer meetings. I could quote scripture before I could ride a bicycle. My father was the kind of preacher who made grown men weep and sinners run to the altar. People used to say the Holy Ghost moved whenever Reverend Calloway opened his mouth. I wanted to be exactly like him. By the time I was 22, I had enrolled in seminary. By 25, I had my own congregation, a modest little church of about 80 people in a small town outside of Atlanta. By 35, that congregation had grown to over 400 souls. I had written 2 books. I was being invited to speak at conferences across the country. On paper, on stage, and behind every pulpit I ever stood at, I was the picture of a man deeply rooted in his faith. But paper lies. The truth is that somewhere between my 38th and 40th birthday, something inside me began to quietly shift. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single crisis of faith. It was more like a slow leak, the kind you don't notice until the tire is already flat. I started reading more. Theology, philosophy, secular literature. I started asking questions I had never allowed myself to ask before. And the more I read, the more I studied, the more I found myself standing in uncomfortable territory. I started doubting hell. Not heaven, no. Heaven I could still hold on to. The idea of a loving God, of grace, of eternal peace, that felt consistent with the God I believed in. But hell? The more I examined it, the more it felt like a medieval scare tactic. A theological construct designed to control people through fear. I began to privately align with what scholars call annihilationism, the idea that the wicked simply cease to exist rather than endure eternal torment. It felt more merciful, more just, more in line with the God of love. And so, quietly, without ever making an announcement or writing a sermon about it, I stopped believing in hell. I still preached about it occasionally. Old habits, old sermons pulled from old files. But in my heart, I had filed hell away with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, comforting or frightening stories we tell to shape behavior, nothing more. My wife, Karen, noticed the shift. She's a discerning woman. 21 years of marriage will either make you blind to your spouse or sharply perceptive, and Karen was always the latter. She told me one evening over dinner, "David, you're not preaching with the same fire anymore." I told her I was just tired, busy, growing. She looked at me the way only a woman who knows you completely can look at you, and she said, "I don't think that's it." She was right. It wasn't tiredness. It was absence. I was preaching from a place of intellectual exercise rather than spiritual conviction. I was a doctor who had stopped believing in the disease he was warning his patients about. And then came the Sunday that changed everything. October 14th. A morning that started like every other Sunday morning of my adult life. I remember waking up that morning with a strange heaviness in my chest. Not pain, not the kind that would have alarmed me. More like pressure. The feeling of something sitting on your sternum that you can't quite shake. I mentioned it to Karen while I was knotting my tie in the bathroom mirror. She asked if I wanted to stay home. I told her I was fine. Pastors don't call in sick on Sunday mornings. I drove to the church alone that day. Karen was coming with the kids in a separate car. It was a 20-minute drive I had made hundreds of times, past the same gas station, the same row of pine trees, the same crumbling brick wall at the edge of town. I remember the drive being unusually quiet. I had forgotten to connect my phone to the car's Bluetooth, so there was no music, no podcast, no morning sermon recordings. Just silence. And in that silence, for reasons I couldn't explain at the time, I felt an overwhelming urge to pray. Not the polished, composed prayer of a practiced preacher. Something rawer than that. I gripped the steering wheel, and I said out loud, into the empty car, "God, if I've gotten something wrong, if there's something you need me to know, I'm asking you to show me. Even if it costs me." I don't know why I said it. To this day, I believe that prayer was not entirely my own. I arrived at the church at 8:47 a.m. Service started at 10. I spent the time between in my office, reviewing my notes. The sermon that morning was from the book of Revelation, ironically enough. I had planned a message about the new heaven and the new earth. A hopeful message. A bright message. Nothing about judgment. Nothing about fire. By 10:03, I was at the pulpit. The sanctuary was full. 412 people that morning, according to our attendance records. I know that number because the church administrator showed me the records weeks later, when I was recovering. 412 people watched what happened next. I opened in prayer, as always. I made a few announcements. I led the congregation in a call and response reading of Scripture. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it had been every single Sunday for the past 20 years. I was comfortable. I was practiced. I was on autopilot. Then I opened my mouth to deliver the first line of my sermon, and my body simply stopped. The chest pressure I had felt that morning detonated into a blinding, crushing wave of pain that started in the center of my chest and exploded outward, down my left arm, up my jaw, across my back. It was like being hit by something invisible and enormous. My notes scattered from the pulpit. My right hand grabbed the edge of the lectern, and for one brief moment, maybe 2 seconds, I was still standing, still upright, looking out at 400 faces who hadn't yet realized what was happening. Then my knees buckled, and the microphone hit the floor, and everything went dark. I want to be precise with you about what I mean when I say dark, because I've heard near-death experiences described as tunnels of light, as floating above operating tables, as warm and peaceful transitions. What I experienced in those first moments was none of that. This was not a gentle darkness. This was absolute, total. The kind of dark that has weight to it, that presses against you like deep water. I was not floating. I was not calm. I was aware, terrifyingly, completely aware, and I was falling. Not metaphorically falling. Falling. The sensation was as physical and undeniable as anything I have ever felt with my living body. Wind rushing past me. Movement downward, fast and accelerating, the way you feel in a dream when you step off a ledge. Except this did not end with a jolt awake in your bed. This continued. I don't know how long I fell. Time in that place does not behave the way it does here. It stretches. It compresses. A moment can feel like a year. A year can pass in a breath. What I know is that I fell until the darkness began to change. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It is a remarkable thing to feel heat in a state of death. Your mind tells you that sensation belongs to the living, that without a body, there should be no feeling. But I felt it, radiating upward from somewhere below me. Not the warmth of a fireplace or a summer afternoon. This was industrial. This was the heat of something vast and hungry. It pressed against my face and arms and chest like opening the door of a furnace the size of a continent. The second thing I noticed was the sound. I have tried many times to accurately describe this sound. The closest I can come is this. Imagine every cry of anguish, every sob of despair, every scream of terror you have ever heard compressed into a single frequency and played at a volume that vibrates in your bones. It was not loud the way a siren is loud. It was loud the way gravity is constant, inescapable, all-encompassing, simply the nature of the environment. It was the sound of suffering without end. And then I stopped falling. I was standing, or existing in the shape of standing, on the edge of something I can only describe as a cliff, a vast, impossible precipice. And below me, stretching outward in every direction as far as I could perceive, was hell. I need you to stay with me here. I need you to not dismiss what I am about to tell you as the fever dream of a man who had too little oxygen to his brain. I need you to hear me when I say that what I saw below that cliff was more real than the screen you are watching this on. More real than the chair beneath you or the air in your lungs. The reality of that place made this world feel like a sketch, like a rough pencil draft of something that hasn't yet been fully rendered. What I saw was a landscape of absolute devastation. The ground below, if you could call it ground, was dark. Not the dark of night, but an active darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than simply lack it. There were formations that resembled rock or earth, but they were wrong in the way things in nightmares are wrong. The proportions distorted, the angles impossible, the scale incomprehensible. There was no sky above this place. Only a ceiling of churning, black-red atmosphere that rolled and boiled like storm clouds made of ash and smoke. And there was fire. Not fire the way we know it. Not the orange and yellow dance of flame that you can warm your hands by. This fire was deep red and purple, with a core of something almost black at its center. It did not flicker. It pulsed, rhythmically, as if it were breathing, as if it were alive. And it was everywhere, rising from fissures in the ground, pouring from the walls of what appeared to be enormous cavern structures in the distance, hanging in the air in slow, deliberate columns. But the fire was not the worst thing. The worst thing was the people. I could see them. Not individually at first. From the precipice where I stood, they appeared almost like a texture on the landscape. A moving, writhing texture that covered every visible surface of that terrible place. But as my perception adjusted, as whatever faculty of sight I possessed in that state sharpened, I began to see them clearly. Men and women, of every age, every appearance. Thousands upon tens of thousands of human souls. And every single one of them was in a state of torment I do not have adequate language to convey. Some were in the fire, submerged in it, as one might be submerged in water, and yet fully conscious, fully aware. I could see their expressions. I could see the recognition in their eyes, the understanding of where they were and why. That understanding, I believe, was its own particular horror. There was no confusion in their faces, no disorientation, just an absolute, crystalline awareness of their situation and a complete knowledge that it would not end. Some were in what appeared to be isolation, encased in the dark rock of that place, alone, without the fire, but trapped in a darkness so complete and so permanent that I believe the isolation itself was the torment. I could sense their consciousness even from where I stood. I could feel the weight of their loneliness the way you feel humidity in the air. It was a presence in that environment, as tangible as the heat. Some wandered the open landscape in a state of restless, endless agitation, moving without purpose or destination. Not walking, more like being propelled by something inside them, some internal anguish that could never be resolved and never be sat with. Their mouths were open. They were among those making the sound I had heard on my descent, that layered, constant chorus of suffering. I watched a man. He appeared to be middle-aged, wearing what looked like ordinary clothing, the kind of clothes a person wears on an unremarkable Tuesday. I watched him kneel on the dark ground and press his hands against his face. And I understood, in the way you understand things in that realm without being told, that he was remembering. That one of the mechanisms of that place was perfect, total recall of every moment of your life, every choice, every turning point, every moment you were given the opportunity to choose differently and did not. He was not being told about his life. He was reliving it, simultaneously, all of it, forever. I began to weep. I wept in a way that I had not wept since childhood. Not the composed, dignified emotion of a pastor who has learned to manage his feelings from behind a pulpit. Something broken and uncontrolled poured out of me as I stood at the edge of that cliff and looked at what stretched below. Because I recognized, in that moment, with a certainty that bypassed every intellectual argument I had constructed over the previous 7 years, I recognized that this place was real, that it had always been real, that every word of warning I had ever softened, every sermon I had ever watered down, every quiet private decision I had made to stop believing, every single one of those choices had consequences I could now see spread out before me like a map. And then I heard a voice. It did not come from below. It came from behind me and above, from a direction that seemed to be the opposite of everything in that terrible landscape. And it said, simply, clearly, in a tone that carried both the weight of a judge and the grief of a father, "Now you know." 2 words. Just 2 words. And they hit me with more force than the heart attack that had put me here. Because packed inside those 2 words was not anger, not punishment. What I felt radiating from that voice was something I can only describe as a grief so enormous it made my own weeping feel like a single drop of water beside an ocean. God was not pleased that this place existed. God was not indifferent to it. What I felt was the grief of someone who had built every bridge, offered every road, set every possible sign and messenger and opportunity, and watched, in full omniscient awareness, every soul in that place choose, in their own way, in their own time, to walk past every single one. Now you know. I turned toward the voice. And what I saw behind me was not hell. I cannot tell you what heaven looks like in the way I have told you what hell looks like. Not because it wasn't there, it was. Not because I didn't perceive it, I did. But because the human mind, even a mind temporarily existing outside its body, does not have the architecture to hold what heaven is, and then return to ordinary language and ordinary life and reconstruct it for someone else. What I can tell you is this. Where hell was heavy, this was weightless. Where hell was hot and suffocating, this was air, the purest, most expansive sense of air you can imagine. Where hell was the sound of suffering, this was something that I can only call living music. Not a song with notes and measures, but a resonance, a frequency of total harmony that I felt in whatever constituted my core in that moment. Where hell was isolation, this was presence. Overwhelming, complete, all-encompassing presence. The feeling of being fully known and fully loved simultaneously, not in spite of everything you are, but with full knowledge of everything you are. I wanted to move toward it. Every part of me, every atom of whatever I was in that moment, strained toward it the way a plant strains toward light. And I believe if I had taken one step in that direction, I would have gone, and I would not have come back. But then I heard a second voice, different from the first, closer. It was Karen, not the Karen standing in the 4th row of my church, screaming my name as my body lay on the floor. But Karen as I had never heard her before, her voice reaching across whatever distance separated where I was from where she was. And in it, I heard something that I believe pulled me back more than anything else could have. She wasn't screaming my name in panic. She was praying it. Quietly, fiercely, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never stopped believing the things I had quietly put down. God, send him back. He's not done. Send him back. There are people who need what only he can say now. And then I was back. I came back to the sensation of hands on my chest. Hard, rhythmic compressions. The sound of someone counting. The distant wail of a siren getting closer. I came back to the smell of the church. The old wood, the candles, the familiar scent of a place I had stood in for 15 years, and it hit me like something sacred, because for one terrifying moment, I had believed I would never smell anything again. I came back to Karen's face directly above mine, tear-streaked, fierce, her lips still moving in prayer even as her eyes watched mine flutter open. Later, in the hospital, I was told I had been in cardiac arrest for approximately 7 minutes. A defibrillator used by one of my congregants, a retired paramedic who had quietly ensured the church had one installed 2 years prior, had restarted my heart before the ambulance arrived. The cardiologist called it a widowmaker heart attack. He told me that the percentage of people who survive a widowmaker outside of a hospital setting is extraordinarily small. He used the word miracle in a clinical context, which is not something cardiologists typically do. I spent 11 days in the hospital. I had emergency surgery. I was given 4 different medications I will take for the rest of my life. My heart sustained damage. My body, at 45, was changed permanently. But none of that, none of the physical reality of what happened, was what consumed my thoughts in those 11 days. What consumed me was the cliff, the voice, the landscape below, the music above, Karen's prayer. I lay in that hospital bed, and I wept more times than I can count. Not from pain, not from fear of death. I wept because I thought about every person I had stood in front of over 20 years of ministry, and I thought about the sermons I had softened, the warnings I had omitted, the years I had spent preaching a comfortable, customized version of a God I had intellectually sculpted to fit my preferences. And I understood that I had been, in the most sincere and well-intentioned way, failing the people who trusted me most. I went back to the pulpit 11 weeks after the heart attack. The church was fuller than it had ever been. Word had spread, the way things spread in church communities, and people came from 3 counties to hear what the pastor who had died on a Sunday morning had to say. I stood at that pulpit for a long time before I spoke. I looked out at the faces. I looked at the place on the floor where the microphone had fallen. I looked at Karen in the 4th row, where she always sits, and she gave me the nod she's been giving me for 21 years. And then I told them everything. Not a polished version. Not a theologically carefully constructed account. Everything. Exactly as I have told you today. The doubt. The slow erosion of belief. The collapse. The darkness. The falling. The heat and the sound in the cliff. What I saw below. The voice. The edge of light and music. Karen's prayer. All of it. Somewhere else, and they chose not to take it. I also want to tell you this. The grief I felt in the voice that said now you know was not the grief of a God who sent people there with satisfaction. It was the grief of a father who never wanted that destination to exist, who constructed every possible alternative, and who weeps, even now, for everyone who ends up there. That grief is the gospel. That grief is why the cross existed. That grief is what I had reduced to a talking point, and what I will spend every remaining Sunday of my life, however many I am given, trying to convey with the honesty it deserves. I am David Calloway. I am 45 years old. I was a pastor who stopped believing in hell. And then I went there. And I am back. And if this story reaches even one person who is standing at a crossroads, who feels the pull of something greater but keeps walking past it, then every terrifying moment of what I experienced was worth it. Don't wait for the cliff's edge to look up. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more encounters from beyond the veil. And in the comments, tell me, has your faith ever been tested to its breaking point? I read every single one.